What I want to do is talk about the politics of making life, and I want to talk about it from the point of view of thinking about technology. I am a cultural anthropologist by training. I spend my time thinking about the intersections of culture and people. There are lots of ways you can think about me, but the most powerful one is to think about me as someone whose job sits at the intersection of technology and culture. So my job is to think about why it is that people use technology, why they reject technology, the ways in which new technologies may or may not succeed. Intel hired me 16 years ago when they realized that the technology they were producing was about to find its way into a new set of places they knew nothing about, mostly the home. When I turned up on my first day at Intel, my new boss sat me down and said, "We're very excited to have a social scientist. We don't quite know what you do, but there are two things we really need your help with." I'm like, "Excellent. What are they?" My new boss says, "Well, the first thing is women." I was enough of an academic at that point that I did ask which women. And my new boss said, "All women." I'm like, "Okay, so you'd like my help with all 3.2 billion women?" "Yes," she said, "that would be great." "Okay. What do you want me to tell you about 3.2 billion women?" She said, "It'd be great if you could tell us what they want." So in my notebook of the day, I wrote down women all and underlined it a lot of times and tried to imagine what is the project you will do that will explain women all to a large silicon company. I had no idea, but it was a nice space to be in. And then I realized this new boss had said there were two things. And if the first thing is women all, it is terrifying to imagine what the second thing might be. And I'm sure I secretly hoped she would say men, because then I knew what I was tackling. But she said instead, no, Intel had what they called at that point an ROW problem. I'm like, okay, what's ROW? My new boss says, "That's rest of world." "Oh God," I said. "Okay, so where's world in this formulation?" My new boss says, "That's America." I'm like, okay, good. "So to recap, then you'd like my help with women and everyone who doesn't live here." And she said, "That would be good." And I thought, well, I'm uniquely qualified to do this job. I'm obviously from rest of world, and I'm a woman, so go me. And in addition to all of my other skills, I also turn out to be the child of an anthropologist. I spent my childhood living on my mother's field sites in central and northern Australia. I spent my childhood living with people who remembered their country before Europeans and before cattle and before fences, and who, whenever my brother and I asked, would take us bush. And so I spent most of my childhood living in this incredible country, not speaking English, not going to school, and killing things. Well, it's like as good as a childhood could ever get, basically. And I never intended to end up in industry, but now that I'm there, I realize my job is always two things. My job is to bring the stories from outside the building into the building and use them to shape the way we think about next generation technologies, products, and services. But my second job is also to tell stories about the future. I think one of the things that anyone who is in the business of making technology is doing is actually making a promise to the future. We are telling stories about what the future might be, what it could be, what we wish it to be. That also means in some ways we have an obligation to be a little bit critical about what those stories are, right, and to critically interrogate them. Well, so let us imagine that part of my job is charting the socio-technical imagination. So mapping the ways in which we think about technology. And there's lots of places you could draw for. I'm kind of, happy in Twitter these days. My two favorite follows on Twitter at the moment, one of them is William Gibson. You should know him as a premier science fiction writer, a man who gave shape to the world many of us now inhabit. Of course, delightfully recently, he posted that in his dreams, he was in Google Street Views. And there's something amazing there to imagine. Here is a technology shaping the imagination, right, such that it embeds itself in our psyche. My second favorite follow on Twitter, actually probably my favorite follow on Twitter at the moment, is something or someone who is tweeting as a Roomba. That would be the robotic vacuum cleaner many of you are familiar with. It has the dubious distinction of being the largest install base of a robotic object on the planet. There are 10 million of them, so the future will not in fact be Skynet going live and destroying us all. It will be your robotic vacuum cleaner unplugging your wireless router. The end will in fact come cleaning up down at this level we will never see, right? Delightfully, this robotic vacuum cleaner has a whole inner life that's kind of amusing, right? Sometimes it imagines other household appliances are talking to it. Frequently, it obsesses about things that make dirt, so it spends a lot of time worrying about toast. It spends an equal amount of time worrying about glitter. Every time it finds glitter, it decides that it must now glamorously strut, a little bit, of goodness here. The reason we all laugh at that, in some ways, the reason it is funny, is that there is a piece of us that wants to imagine that things might come to life. There are lots of stories in our culture about things having an inner life, about the inner life of objects. And there is something here that is delightful, whimsical, and slightly subversive to suggest that a vacuum cleaner in particular is an object that has an inner life. It turns out that one of the things we have as a human culture, and in many cultures, is this fascination with things coming to life. In the Western tradition, there's only a certain set of people who can let things come to life, right? There are a very limited domain of people who are allowed to make life, mostly God. Pretty much everyone else who does it is fraught with peril. You know, think about alchemists making homunculi, not necessarily a good look, the sorcerer's apprentice, Pinocchio, lots of stories about the perils of making things come to life. In other traditions, there are many things that spend their time making things come to life. Gods, wizards, all manner of figures that make things come alive. But really in the Western tradition, for the last 1,500 years, we have had, 1,500 years up to 500 AD, we had stories of things coming to life. The last one of those stories, the one that in some ways shapes our imagination to this day, is the story of the golem. It comes out of Jewish mystical traditions. It is told many times. It is a story that finds its way through the Grimm brothers, through a whole series of other literary imaginations, but it's a story about men making life. It's a story about the Rabbi Lowy in Prague carving a 7-foot figure out of mud in the riverbank, of walking around it 7 times and of slamming God's name into its forehead and bringing it to life. And this creature comes to life and spends its existence defending the Jews in Prague from the predictions of an angry king and the Catholic establishment. It is a creature who had a very specific mission, who wasn't allowed to deviate from that mission, and when it did, things went horribly awry. But the story here of a creature brought to life by the latest technology or by the thing that is invisible and powerful, that trope never goes away. And there's something here about this story that shapes our imaginations. What's important to know, however, is that story, by the time we get to the 1700s, it stops being a story, because there are a series of technologies that appear from 1700 to the 20th century that let you start to imagine making things come to life. It's not just stories anymore, right, because technologies appear. And there's a couple of them that turn out to be really important. The first one, unsurprisingly in some ways, but sort of delightfully also, is the technology of clocks. The mechanism that made a clock work, that made a watch work, that would wind something up so that it would sustain itself, that technology not only created time, but it also creates an entire category of objects called automatons. So basically things that wind up and appear to propel themselves. There's many of them. The most, in some ways, interesting and instructive of them is this one represented here. It was created by a man named Jacques de Vaucanson, clearly French. He made a lot of automatons. This is his, I would say, masterpiece. It came to life, effectively, in 1736. It's called Le Canard Digesteur, and it was a duck. Now, you may go, a duck? Seriously? But seriously, it was a duck. And the most amazing thing about it was duck-like in all of its duckiness. So it could walk foot over foot. You have to have been near ducks to make this make sense to you. It waddled, basically, so that was pretty spectacular, and was actually quite complicated. It had a beak that went like good ducks do. You could feed this duck, which is particularly excellent. Vaucanson also was very concerned that this duck should be as duck-like as possible, so he actually worked out how to make this duck digest. First pass, he used metal, and he put water in it, and it rusted. He became the first person in Europe to work out how to use vulcanized rubber to make a digestive tract for this duck. Now, let's think about this. This duck walks, this duck eats, this duck digests. Let us imagine what the duck does next. Oh, seriously, come on, people. What does the duck do next? It poos, that is correct. Now, in 1736, he couldn't actually work out how to make it digest and then defecate, so he had a pre-cached collection of duck shit inside this duck that released as the duck waddled. This duck was a big success in Europe. This duck entertained the courts of Europe for a very long time because it was remarkably lifelike. It had high levels of verisimilitude or simulacrum, right? It was as duck-like as you could get without actually being a duck. It did everything ducks did. Voltaire, of this duck, wrote, "Without this duck, there is no glory for France." Now, arguably that says more about France and Voltaire than it does about this duck, but there was something about it that was deeply appealing, right? So here, life is being generated by electricity. The same technology turns up in a completely different object in Japan at almost the same time period. There's a man named Tanaka who is the chief engineer for the Emperor of Japan during the early Edo period. He takes the clocks, he reverse engineers them, and he makes karakuri. This is perhaps his most famous one. It's a teacup karakuri. It works by you put tea in its little teacup, it runs across the tabletop, When you pick up the tea, it bows and runs back away from you again. It's clearly not making something that looks like something else, but the notion that you could make something come to life using watch parts is clearly the presence here, right? It's about how do you make life. It doesn't have to be life as we know it, it's just making things come to life. Here the prize is beauty and grace and a ritual, not necessarily simulacrum, right? But there's something here that says watches and clocks, the first way we animate things, right? By the 1800s, the potential that you could animate things with electricity was becoming increasingly part of the conversations amongst the technical and literary elites. So much so that a young woman named Mary Shelley, who was dating Percy Shelley, who kept reading her stories about Gollum and taking her to see frogs being dissected, because that's always a romantic thing to do with your girlfriend, she writes the Frankenstein story, 1816. We all know this story because it seeps into our imaginations. It's a story about Victor Frankenstein who attempts to make life, right? By stitching together a body and running electricity through it. Electricity that for the intellectuals of the day was seen as being this pure life force, right? As opposed to blood, which was seen as being tainted and corrupted because we're on the back end of the French Revolution, right? So here the story is about bringing something to life with electricity, and unsurprisingly about all the perils that go with it, because nothing good is going to come of it, because we know you bring Frankenstein's monster to life, it lumbers around and tries to kill us. A familiar story in many regards, right? And time passes and more technologies appear, and the next technology that is the big technology of the day is, of course, the technology of steam. And once it's harnessed to making trains, people put their purposes to other intents, right? Well, we made trains, what else can we do with a steam engine? Well, it turned out you could attempt to use it as a motor to power a body. So walking men and steam men, very popular in the late 1800s, early 1900s in both the US and Britain, were these, 6-7 foot high men who walked. Now, of course, they had a great bloody steam engine behind them powering that, so it was a little less mysterious than you might have imagined. Sometimes they put a curtain over the steam engine. That didn't really help. You could still see it. But there was something here about using steam as an animating force that continues to suggest that the impulse here, the technical scientific impulse, is how do we use the technologies of the day to bring things to life? Both the stories, but also the realities, right? By the time you get to the 20th century, indeed 100 years ago right now, World War I commences, and suddenly all the technologies that seem to be about bringing things to life are also technologies about destruction. Electricity is mainstreaming, the telegraph is abundant, early experiments with radio, we've started to have movies. There's all this stuff, right, and mechanization. Many technologies that move from the imagination into life, but in a very particular way. And all of those technologies also spark a set of unexpected conversations. Conversations about new social forms, socialism, Marxism, communism, utopian democracies. They spark conversations about gender. The suffragette movement gets a kind of complete charge in some ways out of this moment in time, as do a whole series of other ways of thinking about being in the world. And in the aftermath of World War I, for a lot of thinkers and builders, there was a moment of having to reimagine what it was that we were up to. What is it that we would be making, and what would be the consequences of that making? In 1920 and 1921, there was a young author and playwright in Prague in Czechoslovakia. He was the son of a physician. He came from a relatively comfortable family. He'd been well educated. He wrote interesting things. And in 1921, in January, his second play debuted in Prague. It was a play like nothing that had come before it. It was called Rossum's Universal Robot. And it is the first time the word robot appears in the world, basically, because it is a made-up word. The word robot came from Czechoslovakian, where the word is robota, that means serf, basically, in the feudal system, so a serf to a lord. It also has connotations about drudgery and power relationships. But when Capek wrote the play, Capek writes a story that is so familiar to us now because it's been replayed several times since then. In this story, there is a man named Rossum. He has a factory in which he makes robots. These robots are a biomechanical hybrid. These robots are good for 25 years, then they die. They are capable only of repetitive tasks. In the arc of the play starts with thousands of these robots. By the time the play ends, there are many more thousands of robots. Human beings have mostly been run out of existence. But the robots aren't happy with their lot in life. And they go back and find their maker and demand that A, he extend their life beyond 25 years, and B, he should give them the capacity to be happy, because they'd like to know what that was all about. Seemed like a good idea, thank you very much. Now, on the one hand, this is a play in Czechoslovakia, in Prague, in 1921. There is in some ways no reason it should have left Prague, except that Čapek had a reputation in the West. He was a known quantity, and the play was seen as being a social commentary. It wasn't seen as being a story about technology, it was seen as being a story about mass production and its consequences and a nascent emerging critique of socialism and Marxism. The play was picked up, translated, and turned up on Broadway in October of 1922. In English, clearly. The word robot makes it through translation. The New York Times doesn't think much of the play. They say that the robots bring up less goose flesh than Frankenstein. So less scary, basically. The New York Post and the Mail think it's a winner. So this will tell you something right there about popular tastes in 1922. The play runs for a very long time. Lots of people come to see it, in part because of its social critique, but also one has to imagine in part because this idea of robotness, which has this immediate echo, right? It may be a borrowed word truncated into English, but it becomes a place where all of the automatons and the electric men and the walking men and Frankenstein and Gollum, they all land. And all of that stuff gets caught in this single word. In 1923, the play gets to the West End. In 1924, it is in Tokyo. In 1927, it becomes the first piece of televised science fiction on the radio with the BBC. And in 1937, it's the first piece of televised science fiction when television goes live in England. Because clearly it captures something, right? There's something in it that is a glimmer that is interesting. And there are many different ways that people respond to it. The first and most delightful response to it comes with people actually trying to make it. You've said there's this mechanical hybrid thing, we should go make them. This is Eric. His name is really Eric. He was built by Captain Richards, who was the head of the Motor Engineering Society in the United Kingdom. He was an unsuspecting man in many ways and had the dubious distinction of needing to organise the 1928 conference annual of the Motor Society organisation. He invited the Duke of York. The Duke of York didn't come, and somehow he got it into his head he should make a robot instead. As someone who comes from a Commonwealth country, that is interesting. Can't have royalty, we'll make robot. It's okay. So he makes this robot. This robot is 6.5 feet tall. He is powered through a battery in his feet. He has bright blue eyes that sparkle when he talks. He has a speaker system in him and someone behind stage throwing out his lines. He bows a lot, which is delightful. And he was a big hit. He came to America in 1930. In America, that he was seen to be debonair and charming and very English in his sense of humour. I don't even know how you characterise a robot that way, but okay. And of course, fabulously here, at least in the first instance, he has R-U-R carved into his chest, right? The connection here is clear. He is one of Rossum's universal robots made real and talking. Now, the fact that he looks like a medieval knight is interesting and speculative, and I don't quite know what you would do with it, but there he is, right? He tours the world, as does his younger brother George in years that follow. In other parts of the world, people try and do other things. So here is the first Japanese thing called a robot. No longer a karakuri, but explicitly tagged as a robot. Its name is Gaku Sentuku. Close, my Japanese is terrible. Roughly, the notion here was that it was a thing of natural laws. It was made by a biologist. It is 10 feet high. It is pneumatically driven. Its little hands and arms move. It writes. It premiered in Osaka at a tech expo in 1929, and then was mysteriously, and I would have to say astonishingly, lost in Germany on tour in 1931. I don't know how you lose a 10-foot-high pneumatic Japanese robot, but they did. And that's fine. So, second experiment in robotness. The third one is the American one, because you should get to have one of your own at least here. This robot's name is Electro. He was built by Westinghouse. He premiered in 1939 at the New York World's Fair. He is 7 feet tall, because he should be better and bigger than the English one. He is cased in brushed steel. He has the little, what look like spurs at his back are actually to keep track of the extension cord that powers him. He effectively has a jukebox in his belly because he can speak up to 800 words with a voice prompt and commands. His singularly most delightful and disturbing feature is that he has a set of bellows in his head so he can smoke cigarettes. And he is routinely photographed doing just that. The New York Times says of him that he embodied the worst attributes of the jitterbug age. It took me a while to work out what that was, but basically it was that he was impolite, he called everyone toots. He was just a little bit shifty because he liked to dance, and he smoked cigarettes, which the New York Times thought was kind of appalling for a robot. Electro was, however, terribly popular. He was one of the most popular exhibits at the World's Fair in 1939. He came back in 1940 with a pet dog named Sparko, who was also genuinely excellent. He went on tour, kind of gets a bit diminished during World War II for obvious reasons. When World War II is finished, he doesn't really make the comeback you might have hoped for, and his last public appearance was in a movie called Sex Kittens Go to College. He then spent the intervening 40 years from then until now with his head on a coffee table in Pittsburgh used as a bottle opener. Nonetheless, what is interesting here is in the interwar period, after the play but before World War II, there is this moment where people are convinced they should make robots real. They don't quite know what that means, but they're desperately attempting to do it. Now, of course, while the technical people are doing this, Hollywood, of course, just takes this idea and keeps running with it. From Metropolis onward, the idea of humanoid-looking robots is really seductive. Whether it's Yul Brynner in Westworld, whether it's, Barbarella, because there's got to be at least one girl robot and that is it, or whether it is C-3PO, R2-D2, the Terminator, there are a lot of robots to be had, right? And Hollywood doesn't actually need to worry about where does the electricity come from, because they seem to be self-powered. There's occasional problems, but they are limited. Mostly these, stories turn on problems with aesthetics, problems with morality, problems with ethics, problems with fitting in, but they continue to shape our popular imagination. And most of these stories recall Frankenstein and Gollum and have embedded in them again and again and again this question about the morality of making things come to life. Which leads one to this sort of technical and complicated question, right? In the post-war period, in the last 60 years of our lives, how have people taken forward this idea of robots and made it real? What are the pieces to it, right? And I think it turns on four kind of questions and four problems. Problem number one is this problem of bodies. What is the thing going to look like and how are you going to make it be, right? There is a remarkable man in Melbourne, Australia, one of my hometowns, who has catalogued all the humanoid robots since the word appeared, right? So he has this whole astonishing catalogue of them, and there are a lot. And when you scan this list of robots, there is one of them in the late 1940s, early 1950s, that has parenthetically next to it the word Negroid. And then you realise that none of the others are marked that way. And you have to ask the question, does that make all the other robots white? Because then do robots have race? An interesting problem. The second thing, when you look down this list, you realize there are only 2 robots that are explicitly marked as female, which raises the second order of questions of what is the body that is being built here, right? It is both suddenly gendered and raced. This is one of the first of the robots built in Japan, and you can see the eyes, right? This is a robot that clearly has race as well as class and gender and a body, right? So there is something here about what are these robots embodying? What is the body into which they are coming to life, if you want to think about it that way. And of course, this has other consequences. What do you plan the thing to do? If you think about most of the robots that appeared in factories in the 1970s and 80s, they were arms, mostly to pick things up. Not so much legs, because the legs piece is tricky. But they were arms to do things, right? But the question is, what is the body that you need? Because the second question you need to solve is this question of what's it going to do? The question, effectively, of purpose. What is the robot for? Is it as a substitute human being? Is it just to do drudgery, which is what Capek thought it would be? Is it about companionship? Is it about substituting humanity? And this question here about form and function, they constantly work together, right? What's it doing and what does it look like become this set of questions that are the constant pair. And frankly, I think you can ask these questions of all sorts of technologies, not just of robots, right? This is as true of mobile phones and laptops and Flickr and Twitter and Glossy as it is of anything else. What is the form? What is the function? And last but by no means least, there is the question of, if you have resolved what it looks like and you've resolved what it does, how much are you going to let it do those things by itself? Where is the question of agency, of autonomy? What is the algorithm, if you want to think about it that way? I was in Tokyo not that long ago and I was with some of my colleagues and I saw this sign out of a moving vehicle and stepped out of the moving vehicle to photograph it. Not a good look, but I'm an anthropologist and you get away with that kind of stuff. And I said to my colleagues, oh my God, what does this sign say? Because, there's a picture of a robot. I like robots. They're like, it says robot zone. Okay, good. What does it say in the bit I can't read? And they're like, oh, it says autonomous robots 2 meters in from the curb. To which I say, whose robots? They're like, well, they're autonomous. I'm like, well, what are they doing? They're like, well, they're 2 meters in from the curb. I'm like, aren't you worried? No, that's why the sign is here. And this goes on for a bit in the kind of, swirl that you can have of an ethnographic disconnect, right? Where I'm like, yes, but whose robots? They're like, well, they're autonomous. But what are they doing? Well, who knows? They're autonomous. Well, aren't you concerned? No, that's what the sign is for. So I'm like, ugh. It's like, okay. And they're like, what is your problem? I'm like, okay, if we were in America, this sign wouldn't do it because people would be convinced the robots were going to kill them. My Japanese colleagues just laughed. They're like, oh, that's American science fiction. Here, the robots are our friends. You're like, ah. So this sign really is just there are robots around, sort of an FYI, not a panic now, do you know where the exit is, death ensues. It was simply there are robots, you should probably know they're 2 meters in from the curb. I mean, it really was just cautionary. But that also means it is possible to imagine you've solved the body, you've solved the purpose, and you've set it free. Now, it knows to be 2 meters in from the curb, but that's a different kind of problem, right? So the question becomes, as you think about how you make these things real, what are the challenges you will need to work through in terms of what does it mean to grant a technical artifact agency? What does it mean? What are the guardrails you will put on it? And this is not, simply a matter of saying Asimov's 3 laws of the robot, we've got it taken care of, or what is the decision tree for autonomous vehicles. There is a piece here that says, as you start to make objects and empower them with a certain capacity, how far are you going to let that capacity go? What does it mean to imagine sentience or agency or knowledge, and where will that lead you? Because truthfully, as human beings who live in the 21st century, we know where it gets you. We know what the inner life of robots are. They only ever think 2 things. Usually not the same robots, it ought to be said. We know one thing robots constantly think is kill John Connor. A lot of robots running around saying, kill John Connor. And the other thing we know to attribute to robots is, this. I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. I've seen attack ships on fire off the shoulder of Orion. We know, right? Robots are either having an existential crisis or they're going to kill John Connor. That's kind of it, right? But the reality is, if you give something a body and a purpose and a level of agency, there is this next question about what might be in its mind or its heart, if you'll let me belabor that metaphor, right? What might it be to imagine those things? And the popular landscape, driven by 100 years of visual imagery and 1,000 to 2,000 years of stories, says that if you make something come to life, you give it form, you give it purpose, you give it agency, nothing good comes of this. All of our Just So stories suggest this can't end well. But there have to be other possibilities here, right? And they certainly come from other intellectual traditions. Masaru Mori here, who is probably the premier Japanese roboticist, a man who coined the phrase the uncanny valley, has gone on to think about robots in really interesting and speculative ways. In this, probably his most interesting work, he talks about the reality that robots might be better Buddhists than human beings because they're capable of infinite patience and infinite grace. They may find their way to a higher intentionality quicker than we will. He also says that if you imagine the robots are going to kill you, you probably need to be thinking about what your own self-negativity is rather than visiting it on the robots. He's kind of like, listen, if the robots want to kill you, that says one thing about you or about the fact that you are the robot's maker. So either you're putting all your negativity and your negative baggage on this robot that never did you any harm, or you're actually programming the robot to kill you, in which case there's a secondary set of questions. His mind here is to say, when we imagine that robots will kill us, really what we are doing is externalizing our own anxiety about our own power. And in some ways that's unsurprising, right? The 20th century is a century where we witnessed what our technological competencies could bring. We witnessed what it meant to solve some of these problems and create technologies. Not all of it ended well. Not all of it ended in, happiness. Some of it ended in bleak destruction. And there is something here about the anxieties that we visit on technologies that are frankly not about the technologies per se. They're anxieties about ourselves, right? They're anxieties about our cultures and our prowess and our intentionality and our morals and what makes us human and what makes us deeply, deeply, in some ways, inhuman. Because part of what is going on here, part of the promise and the pitfall of making technology, of making any technology, whether it's robots or almost anything else, the complicated turn here is that we aren't just making technology, we're also making culture. Because every technology object is embedded in the moment in which it is made. It is a mirror of our own internal conversations and aspirations and desires. And all of those technologies sit in a river of 2,000 plus years of stories about what it means to make things and make things come to life. So for me, there is no moment where you are just making technology. There is no moment where what you're up to is the business of just pieces of technology. What you're always doing is also making culture. So every time you think about what you are doing, part of what you're also doing is engaging in the business of making society, of making culture, of moving the conversation forward. And for me, that's actually what makes the job that I get to have and that many of us in this room get to have totally amazing. It's not just about making artifacts, it's about making the structures in which those artifacts will exist and the meanings that will drive them, right? It's about making things come to life and what that means for all of us. So with that, I'm going to pause and say thank you. And Paul, you should come forward. And whoever it was that fixed those slides, you're a wonder. Thank you.
Thank you, Genevieve. Wonderful, wonderful lecture. So I'm standing there thinking, what's our history in creating technology of any sort that's turned around and hurt us? You know, we could talk about nuclear weapons, we could talk about man-made viruses, we could talk about nanotechnology. Do we have a historical reason to be optimistic? Or are there a lot of examples in our history where we take a technology like nuclear bomb and we go blow up a city?
Yeah. I mean, yes. It's a complicated question, right? I mean, I think one of the things that in some ways is most interesting is that many of the technologies of the last 200 plus years have accompanying with them both the kind of classic hype curve as well as this set of stories about great anxieties and fears. And some of them are, I mean, to the point of ridiculousness. I mean, there's some lovely stories that are told about the early introduction of railway trains and of the fact that there were these concerns about what it meant to have people's bodies moving at 60 miles an hour, right? That seemed to be like a quite dangerous thing. Now, not dangerous for men, just dangerous for women. It turned out if you put our bodies in trains and accelerated us past 60 miles an hour, our uteruses would spontaneously leave our bodies. I mean, there's so many things that are complicated about that, I don't know where to start. But there was this kind of notion that, you know, trains were going to be dangerous. And I think, you know, if you look across early electricity, there were all these fears about electricity, some of which were, I mean, they're paradoxical by 21st century standards, right? There were these stories, and indeed some of them in front of the United States Congress when they were first mooting standards in electricity, where the fear was if you electrified people's homes, you would make women and children vulnerable because predators would know they were home. So completely different than the rhetoric we now wrap around electricity as light makes us safe, right? So I think it's the case that many powerful technologies are always accompanied by two sets of narratives, right? This narrative that's intensely optimistic and hopeful, and this narrative that's really bleak, and the challenge is the moment at which those come together and resolve themselves. But, I mean, in some ways, yes, most of the stories of technology aren't necessarily benign.
So, let me ask one more. You know, Intel, more than any other semiconductor company, is famous for its duopoly with Microsoft and creating the chips that create the PCs and computers in general. Is there a move in Intel to think differently, to move toward making life, towards computers that will be more focused on artificial intelligence, or is the move to Intel to push Moore's Law as far as it can and utilize it, you know, wherever?
Well, in some ways, that's a leading question, Your Honor.
Yeah,
'Cause,
I know.
mean, ex-IBM and Watson, there's clearly a whole story to tell there. Listen, I think one of the things that's fascinating about companies like Intel, and arguably many other big tech companies, is that there are frequently multiple pieces going on inside of them. I mean, for Intel, in some ways, the thing that has been the beating heart of Intel for 45 years has been Moore's Law, and being the kind of the high priests, I heard a colleague of mine describe it recently, the high priests of Moore's Law. And, delivering Moore's Law to its, transistors will halve in size, double in density, halve in price every 18 months, that's actually a fairly difficult law to sustain and requires a tremendous amount of engineering prowess and a tremendous amount of willingness to bet on smart people and their capacity, right? And I think for us, the thing that's interesting is not just solving that technical problem and keeping Moore's Law alive, but of imagining what you will do with it. I mean, in the arc of my lifetime, it's been PCs and a move to the cloud, but, if you imagine that you have that kind of capacity and you marry it with software and hardware, there are an extraordinary range of choices of what gets built.
Well, let's take a couple questions. I think Justin will give us relief for one or two.
Or not. Oh, seriously, someone always has a question about now. Usually it's about Ray Kurzweil.
Yes, sir.
Thanks a lot. This was a fantastic presentation. So how did you address the first question or the first task that you got when you first started to work at Intel?
The problem of women and what they want? That question? Yeah. I wish I'd been more successful. And I think one of the hard things for me and for the other women I know in the tech field is how few of us there are. And, Paul started by acknowledging that I'm an Intel fellow, and indeed I am, and there are 73 of us in a company of 107,000, but I'm the only woman. And that's kind of shocking to me, as a good, radical feminist and someone who believes in those issues. And my organization is 50% female, but moving it through the chain has been difficult. So, I've always sort of taken the problem at Intel to be twofold. One is the problem of the larger tech field, which is how do we bring more voices into the conversation? And for me, it's not just about women, it's about all manner of diversity, both in terms of age, gender, race, class, age. I mean, all the studies suggest the more diverse the groups are, the better the decision-making, the better the outcomes. But that's a problem beyond just Intel, right? That's a problem of universities and of high schools and of curriculum. And it's a weird one for me to be talking about because, frankly, I come out of anthropology where 70% of the graduates are female. So we have a different challenge, right? So for me, I think, it's a question about how do you enrich the conversation. And then, truthfully, on the research side, I spent a lot of time talking to women. And that was part of what I did, right? Every study we did had women in it. Truthfully, if you want to know what's going on in a household, it's often good to talk to the woman of the household. They tend to actually know things like where the trash goes and how food gets into the house. I did interview a family once, a long time ago, not in the US, where I was asking about news and information, and the head of household, who was a man, said to me, oh, I read everything in the newspaper. And I said, where does the newspaper come from? And he said, the dining room table. And I said, how does it get to the dining room table? And he said, what do you mean? And I was like, well, I know the dining room table doesn't print it. And he was like, oh, I've never thought of that. At which point I went and found his wife and said, so tell me about how you provision the household. And it was a very different conversation, right? But, I think it's got to be an ongoing thing. And, truthfully, it's not just about the tech field, it's about society. And that's a much harder problem to solve.
One last question. Oh, there's one here.
Second row, green anorak right here. No, you.
What are your thoughts about creating a consciousness greater than our own and where it could lead?
What do I think about creating a consciousness greater than our own and where could it lead? Well, history would suggest nowhere good. I mean, Skynet goes live and kills us all is the, the flip answer. I think there are always really interesting, both intellectual and philosophical and moral challenges that turn on the question of what it means to think about consciousness and intelligence and what it means to build or make those things, right? I mean, I think it's not as straightforward as imagining we will flick a switch and something will come to life and self-regulate. So, I mean, I think, all of those, and, Paul and I were having this conversation over dinner last night about how far are we out from computational power that resembles the power of our brains? And I always think that's a misleading number, right? Because it doesn't solve these other questions about what is the nature of consciousness. And, you know, frankly, that is a question that has a particular interesting wrapper, right? We know that ideas about consciousness in the post-Enlightenment West are very different than they might be in other parts of the world, in other cultural traditions. You know, I think I always am struck by thinking about Turing and Philip K. Dick. You know, Turing, who imagined that a thinking machine would think like a person. And by think, he meant reason. And he meant reason in, you know, something that sits between the Platonic and the Socratic versions, right? It was very much a very particular form of intellectual production. And by the time that concept finds its way through Philip K. Dick into Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep and through Ridley, right, it becomes a question of what does it mean to feel? What does it mean to have a memory? What does it mean to think about love? And, you know, where does consciousness sit, right? Does it sit in the intellect? Does it sit in the affectual side? Do we imagine that consciousness comes with a moral compass? Does it come with a belief in a higher power? And, you know, is it just the precept of human beings? There are certainly places in the world and cultures where consciousness sits in many other objects, not just us. And so I think, you know, starting to even ask the question for me involves a bit more unpacking. Like, whose consciousness where and why? And, you know, under what circumstances? But I also know from a technical thing, it's actually quite hard to accomplish. I don't know if that's comforting or not.
Well, I think, I know there are more questions, but we're getting the hook from Justin. Thank you again for a wonderful, wonderful talk.
If there is a question you'd like answered, I'm on Twitter at FeralData, or you can find me at genevieve.bell@intel.com.